It's May, 1943. The North Atlantic suddenly changed. For 3 years, German U-boats had ruled these waters, stalking Allied convoys, and sending ships to the bottom almost every night. Then over the span of just 30 days, 41 of those submarines vanished. Historians still call it the moment the U-boat war collapsed, but the reason behind that collapse wasn't a new bomb, or a breakthrough weapon, or even a dramatic shift in naval firepower. It began in a cold basement in Liverpool, with a chalked-up floor, a handful of wooden ship models, and a 19-year-old girl the Admirals barely noticed. Her idea, dismissed as silly and childish, would flip the entire Battle of the Atlantic. The officers who visited that basement thought it was a harmless training game, a painted floor, some chalk lines, wooden ships sliding across the grid, nothing more. But once the simulation began, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Convoys kept dying on the floor exactly the way they were dying at sea, and the girl running the model was the only one who understood why. By early 1943, the Atlantic campaign was close to collapse. Convoys were still leaving North America, but every crossing felt like a gamble. German U-boats were sinking ships faster than Allied shipyards could replace them. Escort crews fought as hard as they knew how, yet the casualty lists kept growing. Each month, more tonnage went to the bottom, and the forecasts became darker. If nothing changed, Britain would run short of fuel and food before the year was over. Then the numbers suddenly shifted. In May 1943, the U-boat fleet took a hit it could not ignore. 41 submarines failed to return from patrol in that single month. For a force built on skilled crews and careful coordination, those losses cut deep. The pressure on the Atlantic convoys finally began to ease. What made this turning point unusual was its source. It didn't come from a new weapon or a dramatic victory at sea. It began in a quiet room under Derby House in Liverpool, a floor painted like the Atlantic, chalk lines for grids, and wooden models for ships. This was the Western Approach's tactical unit, and the work in that basement would reshape the entire battle. The room under Derby House didn't look like a war room. Anyone walking in for the first time saw a basement with low ceilings and dim lights. The floor was painted blue to match the Atlantic. White chalk marked shipping lanes and grid squares. Wooden ships sat on the paint like pieces from a giant tabletop game. It seemed simple, almost improvised. But that simplicity was the point. Every inch of the floor represented real distances at sea. Every movement was timed with stopwatches. Every signal from an escort or a U-boat followed strict rules taken from actual combat reports. The result was a simulation far more honest than anything written in a manual. Because WATU didn't rely on assumptions, it relied on what actually happened out there. The people running these games were mostly young women from the Women's Royal Naval Service. They handled the models, timed each maneuver, and tracked every course change. Most were in their late teens or early 20s. Few had ever served on a ship, but they understood the logic of the ocean. They learned how submarines shadowed convoys and how escorts reacted under pressure. They saw patterns the Navy had overlooked. Officers coming in from sea stood on a raised platform above the floor. From there, they issued orders just as they would on the bridge of a real escort. Their decisions were translated into movements on the painted map below. When they closed a gap, the model moved. When they missed a signal, the U-boat slipped forward. Nothing was softened. Nothing was adjusted to protect egos. The floor told the truth. In these sessions, WATU recreated actual convoy battles with surprising accuracy. They replayed night attacks, wolf-pack strikes, and weather conditions that blinded radar. Some officers watched their own past battles unfold again on the paint. They saw mistakes they never noticed in the moment. They saw why a convoy lived, or why it didn't. And slowly, the core problem became impossible to ignore. Whenever an escort rushed toward a submarine contact, the protective ring around the convoy stretched thin. When it stretched too far, a gap opened. When a gap opened, another U-boat took advantage. Once the submarines reached the center of the formation, the damage was already done. WATU's flaw didn't just show the failure, it showed the alternative. When escorts stayed tight and refused to chase, the screen held together. The convoy kept moving, and the U-boats, unable to find a clean path in, backed off or dove out of sight. The lesson was simple, but breaking old habits was not. Officers with years of sea experience had to learn from teenagers holding chalk and wooden ships. It was uncomfortable. It was humbling. But it was also necessary. And among those young women, one stood out more than the rest. Her name was Janet O'Kell. Janet O'Kell entered Derby House as one of the youngest women ever assigned there, 19 years old. Fresh from mathematics classes, and carrying the calm focus of someone who solved problems by understanding their structure rather than forcing an answer. The pit felt overwhelming on her first days. Not because of noise or activity, but because of how strange it looked. A basement with concrete walls, a floor painted deep blue, lines of chalk that cut across the room like the latitude and longitude of the North Atlantic. Small wooden ships arranged in formations that shifted with each order shouted from the platform above. Officers stood on the raised catwalk, reenacting convoy battles they had fought only weeks earlier. Every command, turn to port, increase speed, maintain course, translated instantly into movements below. One destroyer swung wide to investigate a suspected contact. Another held position near a merchant column. A third drifted half a mile too far from its station. From the floor, these changes looked subtle. From above, they looked harmless. But from the perspective of a submarine, hidden somewhere beyond the edges of the map, they were opportunities. Janet didn't need long to sense that rhythm. Her attention shifted naturally from formation to formation. Whenever an escort eased just slightly out of place, the pattern of the screen changed its balance. Whenever two destroyers focused on the same direction, a thin corridor opened on the opposite side. Whenever a single decision broke the symmetry of the convoy, the entire defense weakened. Nothing about this was written in a manual. It was the kind of truth that only appeared when dozens of small movements came together in one compressed view. Captain Gilbert Roberts saw her studying the floor more closely than everyone else, not with the excitement of a newcomer, but with the caution of someone who understood that the room was showing them things they were never meant to miss. He began asking her quiet questions during breaks. What looked off in that last formation? Where would a submarine position itself if it spotted that escort drifting? Which angle created the fastest path through the screen? Her answers weren't guesses. She used distances, time intervals, and turning radii, as if she had been navigating for years. A bow swinging outward by a single grid square told her all she needed to know about the next 10 minutes of the engagement. Before long, Roberts assigned her to a new position, one that required a different mindset entirely. She would take control of the U-boats in the simulations. That shift changed everything. Instead of observing from the side of the room, Janet now acted from the perspective of the enemy. She began reviewing captured German signals and tactical notes. She traced the common approaches U-boats used after shadowing a convoy for hours. She studied how wolf packs coordinated attacks at night and how submarines used darkness, radio silence, and patience more effectively than British doctrine expected. With that knowledge anchored in her mind, she stepped onto the painted floor with a box of submarine models. Her movements were careful, almost delicate. One U-boat shadowed the convoy from astern. Another waited along the perimeter, positioned just outside the range of the escorts. A third alternated depth and course until the destroyers assumed it had slipped away. Janet rarely rushed. Her timing reflected something officers at sea often missed in real combat. U-boats didn't fight for speed, they fought for angles. As the escort screen shifted, she adjusted her submarines by inches. A destroyer chasing a false contact gave her room to slip a model closer. A delayed turn from a frigate turned a narrow corridor into a clear entry point. When escorts became too aggressive, pulling away from the convoy's core, she positioned her pieces exactly where German captains would have waited. Minutes later, the floor came alive. Torpedo tracks, drawn in thin red chalk, cut across the painted ocean. Merchants were pulled from the board. Escorts wheeled around to react, only to discover they were now too far from the next attack. And from her place in the pit, Janet explained it all. Every strike, every breach, every failure in the escort line. Her tone stayed steady, never dramatic, just direct, precise, and uncomfortably accurate. Officers who had spent years at sea found themselves outmaneuvered in simulations that lasted barely half an hour. Some walked away frustrated. Others returned the next morning, determined to understand how she predicted their choices so easily. Janet didn't predict anything. She simply followed the logic of the floor, and the floor didn't lie. What she uncovered was the flaw at the center of British convoy defense. Every time an escort chased, the convoy weakened. It was a simple observation, and soon it would force the most important test of her young career, a test watched by Admiral Max Horton himself. Admiral Max Horton came to Derby House on a cold March morning in 1943. The visit wasn't public. and it wasn't formal. He simply walked down the narrow stairs into the basement, the same way dozens of junior officers had done before him. The pit fell quiet as he entered. The room was small, dim, and colder than it should have been. Painted ocean on the floor, chalk lines cutting across it. Wooden models standing in formation. It looked more like a forgotten classroom than the nerve center of a global war. Horton took his time looking around. Nothing about the setup seemed impressive at first, but he paid attention to the details: how the scale worked, how distance mapped to real miles, how every movement matched an actual maneuver at sea. Roberts stepped beside him and walked through the system. The timing, the rules, the way officers used the platform above as if it were the bridge of a destroyer. Horton listened without comment, weighing each part of the explanation with the quiet patience of a man who had spent his life studying the Atlantic. When Roberts finished, Horton asked one question: "Who's handling the submarines today?" Janet stepped forward, a calm expression, a small tray of U-boat models in her hands. Nothing about her presence suggested she was about to test the most senior anti-submarine officer in Britain. Horton gave a simple nod. "Let's begin." The scenario was familiar: winter seas, poor visibility, a large convoy protected by 8 escorts. Horton took the platform and formed the outer ring the Navy had relied on for years: wide spacing, aggressive posture, steady sweeps to detect any threat. Down on the floor, Janet began moving her submarines. Her adjustments were subtle, almost easy to miss: a shift along the grid, a small change in heading, everything quiet, deliberate, precise. An escort reacted to a possible contact and eased outward. Another followed to support the search. For a few seconds, the formation looked normal. Then the imbalance appeared. A narrow lane opened in the center screen. Janet positioned a U-boat in that space, with a single smooth motion. A red chalk line followed. One merchant came off the board. The officers watching didn't speak. Horton didn't either. He shifted his escorts again, trying to restore the shape of the screen, but every change created another point of weakness. Janet used each one with the same steady pace, never rushed, never dramatic, just consistent exploitation of the formation's gaps. Another torpedo line. A third. Each one timed to the second. Roberts called the end of the run. 17 ships gone. No submarine caught. Horton studied the board in silence. Nothing about the result looked exaggerated. Every loss connected directly to decisions he had made. After a moment, he set the chalkboard eraser back on the rail. "Reset the map," he said. The next run used the tighter defensive screen WATU had developed. No wide arcs, no sudden chases, just a disciplined ring around the convoy. Janet tried to find a way in, adjusting her submarines with the same patience as before. Every angle she tested closed before she could use it. The formation held. The convoy stayed intact. Roberts ended the run with a single word: clear. Horton didn't take his eyes off the floor. He understood exactly what he had just seen. "This is the doctrine," he said quietly. "Teach it to everyone." And with that decision, the turning point of the Atlantic War finally began. After Horton's visit, Derby House changed overnight. The quiet basement that once seemed hidden from the real war suddenly became the place every escort commander had to pass through. Orders went out across the western approaches. Commanders were told to report to Liverpool for immediate tactical instruction. No exceptions, no delays. Each officer would step into the pit, face the same simulations Horton had seen, and learn the new escort doctrine. Groups arrived one after another. Veterans who had survived multiple Atlantic crossings, young lieutenants fresh from training, men who believed in the old tactics, and others who weren't sure anymore. The WRNS guided them through the sessions. Janet handled many of the demonstrations herself. Some officers tried to beat her on the first run. Others hesitated, unsure how a teenager could represent an enemy they'd fought for months. But the floor treated everyone the same. If a formation stretched too thin, the opening appeared. If an escort chased too hard, the convoy weakened. Janet used the gaps with the same calm precision each time. By the end of the first week, most commanders understood the point. The problem wasn't bravery or skill. The problem was distance. When escorts left their stations to chase a contact, they exposed the convoy to the rest of the wolfpack. WATU showed them a different rhythm: hold the line, stay tight, deny the angles, and force the submarines to withdraw. Training accelerated. More officers arrived. More simulations ran. Every session left chalk dust on the floor, and a clearer understanding of how the Atlantic had to be fought. By early April, the new doctrine began reaching the sea. Convoys leaving Halifax and New York sailed with commanders who had just stood in the pit days earlier. They knew the pattern, they knew the traps, and they knew what would happen if they chased. Reports from the first crossings showed a shift. U-boats still shadowed the convoys, but the openings they depended on weren't appearing. Escorts held their formation. Attacks came late, hit nothing, and faded into the dark. German commanders noted the change too. Messages intercepted through intelligence mentioned convoys that behaved unnaturally tight and unusually disciplined. The old opportunities had begun to vanish. Then came May. The month opened with a series of aggressive Wolfpack deployments. Dönitz committed more submarines to the North Atlantic than at any point in the previous year. He expected results. He expected merchant shipping to fall in large numbers. Instead, something entirely different happened. Convoy after convoy reached port almost untouched. Escorts coordinated their screens with new confidence. Air patrols, freed from the chaos of scattered formations, struck U-boats on the surface. The old German tactics, shadow, wait, isolate, and strike, no longer worked. Losses mounted quickly. In the first week of May, several submarines failed to return. A few more disappeared in the second week. By mid-month, entire Wolfpacks began to break apart under pressure they had never faced before. Some were caught while trying to reposition, others were driven deep and forced to surface with failing batteries. Each report that reached Derby House told the same story. The screen held, and the U-boats had no room left to maneuver. By the end of the month, the number reached 41. 41 submarines lost in 30 days. Crews that had once operated with near total freedom could no longer get close. Dönitz reviewed the situation with growing alarm. He knew the U-boat arm couldn't sustain losses at that rate. He ordered a full withdrawal from the North Atlantic, the first major retreat of the campaign. The battle had turned, not by new weaponry, not by overwhelming firepower, but by officers who finally understood how to hold their formation, and by a group of young women who taught them how to do it. And at the center of that shift was a 19-year-old with a tray of wooden submarines. When May 1943 ended, the Atlantic looked different. Convoys were arriving with fewer losses. Escorts no longer scattered across the ocean in frantic chases. The defensive screen had become a disciplined ring instead of a loose collection of well-intentioned ships. And the basement at Derby House, cold, cramped, and easy to overlook, had become the unlikely center of that transformation. Training continued through the summer. More officers passed through the pit, more simulations ran. By autumn, almost every escort commander in the western approaches had stood on that raised platform and learned the pattern that saved convoys. The WRNS kept working through long nights, drawing chalk lines until their hands were white with dust. The wooden ships wore down from constant use. The floor needed repainting more than once. But the method never changed, and the results never wavered. Janet remained in the pit until 1945. Hundreds of simulations. Thousands of decisions. Years spent inside a room that most people in the building didn't even realize existed. She never asked for recognition. She never expected any. When the war ended, WATU was classified. The staff signed the Official Secrets Act and returned to ordinary life. Some became teachers. Others started families. A few stayed in the Navy. None could talk about what they had done. For decades, the basement's impact lived only in the memories of the officers who passed through it. Convoys had survived because of a doctrine they learned there, but the people who created that doctrine stayed anonymous. The story resurfaced slowly. A mention in a memoir, a footnote in a study, then more detailed research as files were declassified. Historians began piecing together what had happened beneath Derby House. The numbers were startling. Thousands of commanders trained, tactics adopted across 3 navies, merchant losses cut by more than 70% in the months after the new doctrine spread. 41 U-boats destroyed in a single month, an outcome the German Naval Command had never imagined. And woven through all of it was the work of a 19-year-old who understood patterns better than the doctrine of her time. Janet O'Kell passed away in 2009. Her obituary was a short paragraph. No mention of WATU. No hint of the lives saved by what she helped create. But the legacy still exists. Naval academies continue to teach escort concepts based on the principles developed in that basement. Defensive screens still rely on the same spacing rules that Janet demonstrated with chalk and wooden ships. Modern anti-submarine training still echoes the lessons she explained on the floor. If you walk through the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich today, you'll find a small display tucked between larger exhibits. A photograph from 1943 shows 11 young women standing in the pit, chalk dust on their uniforms, models at their feet. Janet is third from the left, focused, calm, unaware of the scale of what she was helping shape. No headline marked that moment, no broadcast announced the change. Yet the turning point of the Atlantic didn't happen aboard a battleship or in a war room full of admirals. It happened in a basement where people looked closely at a problem others had learned to ignore. And in that space, a young woman with no experience at sea helped end the deadliest chapter of the U-boat war. History often remembers the loud victories, the battles with fire and smoke, but sometimes the turning point comes from a piece of chalk, a quiet room, and someone who's willing to see what others don't.